I'm here to talk about our experience with going native. I'm from a company called Hive, and we do smart homes applications. It's quite a vast ecosystem, and delivering something in web, Android, and iOS proved to be too difficult, so we decided to take our React code and take it to the native world. And this whole talk is essentially about what can we take from our web code, what can we reuse, and why is that? So I sort of split it into three logical bits. One would be UI components, one would be styling, and business logic. When it comes to components, I originally made an assumption that those are the things we can reuse, since we can essentially define JSX the same way, then it gets translated into some sort of data blob, and then the target platform decides how to render it. But I was completely wrong on that one. And the reason for why that doesn't actually work, is the fact that there are a lot of different differences between the platforms that we're targeting. So for example, you can see these components for web, and they are all made essentially around the semantics of the page, because web was historically a document, it was a page, where it was more about the content rather than the interactions. Whereas mobile applications and the sort of toolkit that we are given as developers are all around interactions. They are all about what the user does with the application. So, for example, on web, you would have a paragraph and a span and an H1 and a header, while on native applications, you would expect a flat list and a date picker and slider and scroll views and that kind of stuff. And there are ways of sort of saying, well, okay, if I render a view in a native world, that would probably map to a div. If I render out a text, that would probably be a paragraph. But what would I do with a scroll view or a flat list? There is no readily available component in web for that. And exactly the same way it works the other way around. If I have an H1, I can't actually translate it to just text because I'm losing some amount of information about what the meaning of the component is. So essentially, those two platforms are next to impossible to map onto each other very well. And that's the reason why we decided to rebuild the UI from scratch again. It was a bit of a headache, let's face it, because you're essentially rewriting exactly the same thing over and over again. The thing that you wrote for web, you're suddenly having to write again in a native world. But in the end, that kind of really worked out for us. There are some edge cases where we did manage to share UI components, and those would be logical components or components that don't actually render anything specific. And then components where we defined the end components that we render as props. So as an example for the logic component, we have a lot of sort of conditional features in our applications. And this conditional feature is a component that will decide whether to render the children or not based on some sort of conditions being met or not being met. So as you can see in this example, all we do is we are either rendering something or not rendering something, but what that something is decided somewhere else. So in this case, we can use it in both web and native. And then another example where I said that we are passing the end components as props is in SVGs. We have practically all our assets in SVGs because they, you can color them, they scale nicely. But unfortunately, if you have ever seen an SVG, it is practically XML. It is just, tags. So what do you do with that in native world? There is a library for SVG components. And what we did was that we wrapped all our SVGs in React components, and then we injected whatever components we wanted to use in the end through properties. So you can see that we had to sort of slightly change all the SVGs to be with capital letters to signify that there are all components. And then in both projects, we have these maps where we say, if you see an uppercase SVG, this particular one is for web, so just display an SVG tag. And we have a similar map like that in React Native as well. So that allows us to use the same components or the same UI elements in both projects, but it does require some sort of boilerplating around it. Next thing, we're onto styling. So when React Native developers were developing React Native, they decided to use CSS, which is weird because pretty much every single web developer hates it. So it's a strange decision, but it does mean in the end that we can reuse our styles, and that is brilliant. We're using styled components because they make it really easy. They allow us to write CSS as CSS without the weirdness of CSS in JS. You can see that there is style.text over there, which makes it the React Native bit, but the string after that is just CSS, and that can be equally well used on web and in React Native. Of course, there are some differences. In React Native, everything is flexed by default. It's flexed into a column, not into a row. So there are some differences, but in terms of variables, styling, font sizes, etc., you can define everything just once. And that leads to bigger design consistency across your platforms as well, which is really cool. Last but not least, there is business logic. And that was something that we were quite worried about, because our native applications, because we communicate directly with hardware devices, they are using a lot of Bluetooth. They are using camera and practically everything that you can imagine, scanning for Wi-Fi networks. So we thought that a lot of the business logic will have to be written from scratch, and potentially we thought we might actually need to write native code, which we as JavaScript developers were a little bit worried about. But it turns out that there are sort of two different things when it comes to business logic. One is the native stuff, and that is the hardware integration that I was mentioning, and it is also using some native SDKs. There are companies like Adobe that think it's a great idea to hide all their code behind an SDK so you can't actually build your own thing. So for example, all our analytics has to be done natively. However, there's also a lot of stuff that you can just run like JavaScript, because React Native is basically sitting in the JavaScript thread, and we can use that to our advantage. And that means that all our store, Redux, Mobx, it doesn't particularly matter, we just happen to use Redux, and all our translations, they can all be reused without any change, and that is brilliant. It means that all our user actions, sagas, reducers, connectors, all of that, because it has been already written for web, we don't have to do that again. And that speeds up our development process so much. Similarly, we can reuse translations and the whole React entl that sits behind it. So we can actually make sure that all the copy and the way we communicate with the user is always consistent. So when it comes to actual writing of what we do when we're moving from web to native, we write a lot of components. As I mentioned, those can't really be reused. We are still writing some styles as well, so I've sort of lumped this UI bit into one big thing, and that is the main thing we work on. Then there's a little bit of business logic, but vast majority of that is just us moving the business logic files from like the web bit into the shared folder so that we can reuse them. And thanks to the fact that React Native has an amazing ecosystem of libraries, we practically didn't have to write native code. We had to make some minor different changes for push notifications, and I believe for Bluetooth, but that was about it. Everything else we're just using out of the box. So the amount of native code we have had to written was very minimal. I think I maybe wrote like 2 or 3 lines, and that was about it. So as a JavaScript developer, as a web developer, you can actually go to the native world and extremely easily build your own mobile applications, which is incredibly empowering. And so just to sum up, we can't reuse UI components, we can kind of reuse styling, but the biggest strength is that we can reuse all the business logic, and that gives us a lot of speed in development. That will be everything from me. Thank you very much.